So thank you all for joining this panel. Past few months, we worked with a small and dedicated group on the One Water working group called Governance and Implementation. Governance meaning, how are we currently organized around all water cycle challenges, and also barriers that we are facing through the way we are organized. And evenly important, I would say, how do we overcome these challenges? Utilizing new technologies, which has been front and center as part of our research. So these findings are coming together as we speak. We hope to launch our paper, submit to USNL our paper by somewhere next week or the week after, definitely before the end of the year. And we are very happy to have some of our key contributors join our panel today. We have introductions by Miami-Dade County Water and Sewer Department. We have Miami-Dade County Office of Resilience. We already heard from CHED, the Delaware River Basin Commission, and we're also very pleased to have Waternet from the City of Amsterdam with us. So with that, it's a pleasure to introduce my paper co-lead, Meghna Babar-Siebens. Dr. Babar-Siebens is an associate professor of water resources engineering in the School of Civil and Construction Engineering at Oregon State University. She and her students conduct interdisciplinary research in the field of hydroinformatics and artificial intelligence to develop innovative and effective monitoring, simulation optimization, and decision support technologies for sustainable planning and management of water-based systems, including watershed systems and stormwater infrastructure. Meghna, I'm happy to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Edgar. Let me see if I can share my screen. What I'm going to do today is kind of give everybody a little summary of our working group that has been looking at the Smart One Water governance and implementation strategy for moving forward for the ERC, how to think about, partner with many of the folks who are already here in the call today and also beyond in terms of how do we launch this effort into communities, whether they are rural communities, urban communities, small utilities, big utilities, or even other folks managing water resources or agriculture water or water of energy and so on. So what I'm going to do is, excuse me, quick summary from this. This is a presentation that some of you who attended the talks yesterday also saw. So I'm just going to give you another repeat of some of the summary points for the new audience who are here today. But then also we had a breakout session yesterday, as Edgar was mentioning, where we did quite a bit of brainstorming with our attendees, and some of the results from that breakout session in terms of what we learned from the folks who attended it, how we could launch a plan for governance and implementation of Smart One Water across multiple jurisdictions and organizations and groups and end users and stakeholders. So I'll present some of that and sort of give you guys an introduction so you're sort of set up for the rest of the talks and in this panel. And, and we would love to get input from the larger community who's present today as we think about some of these points. So as Sunil also mentioned earlier today in the morning, the Smart One Water effort is really trying to change our conversation around how we manage water, not just in stormwater, wastewater, or drinking water, but really across the entire One Water paradigm of water resources, watersheds, you're looking at agriculture water, and so on and so forth. And so when you think about who's going to really benefit from this, when you think about products, and let me actually put this on, hold on, there you go. So when you think about, the technologies that are going to come out of this ERC, things like the Smart One Water DIAS or the Digital Analysis Integrated Management System, you're sort of trying to provide communities an opportunity to really operationalize how they can manage their water systems, especially One Water systems, in a resilient and sustainable manner. So, and the way the ERC really poses to do that is by transforming how artificial intelligence-driven technologies can actually scale our ability to share data and models and tools. And many of these discussions were also, many of the speakers also today talked about the need for sharing and, and being able to scale our sharing capabilities. And then also the other benefit is that it will provide decision support for adaptive management of the watersheds and water infrastructure at multiple scales. So this is kind of the value proposition of some of the products that the ERC would come out with. But one thing that is important for all of us to think about is, as CRC progresses with the science, is really there's going to be a need for a governance plan. Like, how do we actually govern the smart water technologies and the data that comes out of this effort, and actually implement the smart water in multiple communities and in different types of communities too. So there is a strong need for a governance and implementation plan for all the products that come out of this effort. So in our working group, actually, what we were doing was trying to think about the governance and implementation of smart water from the perspective of assets, actors, and analytics. So essentially, when you think about smart water, what you're really doing is you're sort of generating these digital assets, right? And these digital assets are going to interface with water assets. We basically kind of classify these water assets as our natural water assets or built assets or even financial assets. And then we also said, all right, these digital assets will also need to interface with our water actors. So these are basically all of us, everyone that provide, are humans, right? And provide context to the human and political assets of a community or cultural and social assets of a community. As well as these digital assets will have to interface with the water analytics that can help us improve the capabilities of our communities to do advanced analysis, whether it's for monitoring, decision-making, or even communication. And Pablo gave a really great example or case study of what's happening in Spain. And so those kinds of capabilities will have to be scaled up so that many communities can benefit from them. So this is an example I'm kind of again sharing with all of you with one of our team consists of multiple folks who've been working on this. And so this is one of an example they created. Basically, what you're really seeing here is that when you think about, say, for example, a water management problem related to smart raw water data collection. So imagine a utility that has to think about all of its assets, right? For example, a natural stream where you have sensors, looking at flows and water quality. Then you might also have sensors in your groundwater resources, looking at water levels, recharge, water quality, other kinds of parameters. And all of this information, these are the two primary resources, but you might also have access to other resources like reclaimed water or water coming from other resources like maybe industry that can be reused for, say, agriculture, irrigation, for example, or just in urban areas, urban water recycle. So you have sensors looking at multiple water resources, and the decision really is to for utilities to think about, well, so these are my assets. How do I now make a decision on which asset to use or derive my water for in order to meet my water demand? And the demand is really where you sort of look at now all the different actors, right? So your customers will be your actors. So they'll have all the behavioral and biases and normative issues that we'll have to think about. And there's data that to support that, in terms of, we'll have to think about how do we support their needs using digital assets. And then also our utilities themselves are also actors in terms of the decisions they're making in terms of what water to collect. And so, beyond the assets and the actors that exist in the water management problem, you also will have to do some analytics, and you'll need digital assets to support those analytics, whether they are, in terms of storage or, but also in terms of decision-making, in terms of where should the water supply come from? How do I most adaptively use my multiple resources of water? So this sort of gives you an idea of how you can think about your water management problem and classify in terms of all the different water assets, analytics, and actors. And so when you think about the governance of these assets, actors, analytics, they will require their own plan for management and stewardship. For example, questions like, where is this data held and how is this data stored? Who would have access to the data related to assets or actors or even analytics? How, who will be accountable for the data, and how do you measure the data quality, and what kind of laws and regulations will need to be obeyed as you move from one region to another, or even from one country to another country. So the governance, when you think about for these smart water digital assets, really think, it's like, excuse me, we'll have to think about all the people and processes and technologies that will be needed to be managed and to protect our digital assets, right? All your smart water assets, so that the smart water data that is obtained from our digital assets and then are generally understandable, and they are correct and they're complete, and they're trustworthy, secure, and discoverable. So many of the issues related to findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability, and many of the other speakers also today talked about and touched on, will be also very important and relevant for smart one water digital assets. And then, of course, we'll also have to think about, while coming up with the governance plans for smart one water technologies, there'll be technical issues and aspects we'll have to think about in terms of how to manage the data and the data quality, but also business aspects in terms of how do you make a business case for smart one water, and what are the financial issues that need to be taken care of, how to support these kinds of technologies in communities moving forward. And then what kind of organizational structures will be required to support not just the management and sustainability of these technologies, but also, in terms of interfacing with communities, and who supports and who organizes. And like, if you have multiple governance structures already in water, they're already siloed, how do you create partnerships? Should it be maybe a consortium, or should there be one separate department, for example, that manages smart one water technologies? So lots of different questions. And so we posed those questions to our group, and we sort of in the breakout sessions, asked these questions to them and said, okay, so let's focus on what do you think the governance and implementation for smart one water could look like in the future? And so the first question we asked them was, in terms of, and this is a question actually we posed to all of you also, to think about in terms of what kinds of short-term and long-term actions do you think we need to do or undertake in order to advance an integrated and collaborative governance of these digital assets in our communities? For example, do you think there should be a new organization that does all the governance for digital assets that are, related to One Water assets, One Water actors, or One Water analytics? And the other question we asked our group and our colleagues were about how do you think, we see lots of case studies here today, and the other speakers who come after me will be talking about different case studies also where smart one water technologies are beginning to be adopted or are being used. But as you think about a much more larger national scale effort or even international scale effort, how do you think we would disseminate these technologies and implement them and help not just larger cities and communities, but also rural communities and smaller utilities to be also be in a position to adopt these technologies and use them and implement them? So those are the questions we asked our group. And in the breakout session, we went through a design process for developing a governance and implementation plan. And I'll show you this graphic. It looks something like this. And we'll basically use this graphic again in the question session later on in a few minutes. But the idea here is that we have our One Water assets and actors and analytics. And currently, we sort of identify what is the current governance and implementation of all of the assets and actors and analytics in the water, space, right? And so what are the barriers in order to get to the goal of having a governance of smart one water governance and implementation? So if you can first identify the barriers, and many of these barriers might be, related to just the assets or actors, or those barriers might be barriers for both assets and actors, for example. So the idea is to identify all the barriers that currently exist and that are internal to our region, for example, but some of them could be also external to the water management problem, right? For example, like maybe international policies or other regulations or markets that could drive or create new barriers for moving to a smart one water governance. So once you identify those barriers, we sort of say, all right, well, let's select some barriers, prioritize them, and then identify what kind of strategic actions one would have to undertake in order to sort of come up with strategic plans, which are recommended strategic plans for launching a governance, system, right? And so once you identify those recommended strategic plan through different activities, you sort of identify what kinds of resources are available to us as a community, as well as what new resources are needed in terms of trying to come up with actual implementation of the governance plan and organizations moving forward, so that we can finally move towards the goal of having a much more integrated smart one water governance and implementation. And so we were using this kind of figure as a way to guide the discussion. And so here are just some thoughts. I'm going to put them on the screen, and this is still work in progress. So, as new discussions come through our meeting, we'll definitely be adding. But things like, for example, right now, folks are talking about how data is currently scattered in different organizations. There are legacy databases, and the current, there are no data standards, or interoperability is an issue. For example, there are no data, integrated data platforms. And then we talked about a range of different, barriers. Some of them are technical, some of them definitely you see people related, social related, political barriers, messaging, situational awareness, schedules, budgets, silos. So these are the barriers that we have to undertake and face in terms of coming up with what are the, how do we move forward towards smartphone water governance. And then based on the barriers, the discussion sort of moved on next to identifying all the strategic actions one could undertake in terms of maybe identifying pilot projects, leveraging existing partnerships or existing research, identifying organizational models for smartphone water, exploring that research and practice and best practices, as well as, for example, identifying what are the drivers for collaboration. Why would why would utilities want to collaborate and be part of a One Water paradigm, I guess. So lots of different ideas came in there, and we'll touch base on these again in the question session. But the goal was that when you go into these barriers and strategies, you really sort of, the ERC, is sort of position itself to help undertake many of the different activities and support many of the different activities that would help us go through this design process or go through this process of coming up with a governance and an implementation plan, as well as start beginning to execute the plan in partnership with all of you and all the different partners. And so, for example, some of the implementation strategies that we were coming up with in that group discussion were like things like, one of the implementation could be to develop a new organizational structure for smartphone water, or maybe leverage existing organizational structures, develop some financial instruments to support long-term smartphone water, approach in communities, as well as things like streamlining existing synergies. So even if there are, different groups are collecting different types of data on assets, are there some synergies in what kind of data is being collected that can be streamlined? So exploring that space would be another, kinds of, I guess, resources and activities we'll have to do in order to identify how we launch the smartphone water into communities. So that's kind of the big picture. I wanted to sort of, it's a very busy diagram, as you guys can see, but there's still work in progress. But I wanted to sort of set the stage for the remaining talks, where we will be talking about different application and case studies of how some of the issues you see in the slide, folks are already addressing or exploring. So with that, I think that's the last slide I had. So Edgar, I think I'm done. You can
yeah, thank you, Meghna. And I realized from the discussions we had yesterday, it's the barriers, and it's almost like the tip of the iceberg. So I'm sure for our paper we'll need to refine that a little bit and prioritize what should happen short, near to longer term, to bring more clarity in the barriers. What is holding us back, and what strategies do we need to come up with, to work towards implementation? But a great graphic, and we will probably discuss that with the panel discussion after our next speaker, which is Debbie Greiner. It's a pleasure to introduce Debbie, who has 25 years of public service, the majority of which has been with Miami-Dade County, working on sustainability and resilience planning and implementation. Debbie joined Miami-Dade County Water and Sewer Department in 2017, lead the utility's first resilience division, which is tasked with operationalizing resilience throughout the department's programs. Debbie oversees the water conservation program, expanding energy efficiency and renewable energy initiatives, and reducing vulnerabilities to acute shocks and longer-term stresses, such as sea level rise. Debbie, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I'm going to start sharing my screen and we'll get started. If you could tell me, Edgar, when you can see my screen.
Not yet.
Not yet. Almost there, I think. There. That should do it.
Yeah, thank you.
You see it, Edgar?
Yes, there you go.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay. Now if I can just get it to start. There you go. All right. Yeah, thanks so much. I just want to share Water and Sewer's perspective on, the initiating a shift to One Water approaches, and at least in the water supply and wastewater treatment that we manage, but then across broader stakeholders. So to do that, I do need to give you a little overview of our area, and then some challenges that all water utilities face, really, and then go broader so you can understand how we've looked at our broader network of stakeholders to include other water services and providers. And then I'll end with just some examples of, I really like that actors, assets, and analytics framework. So I tried to put our examples in that perspective for you today. So Miami-Dade Water and Sewer, we are the largest water and wastewater utility in Southeast United States. We provide service to 2.3 million residents. We withdraw over 300 million gallons a day from over 90 wells from our Biscayne Aquifer, which is our main source of drinking water. We have 3 water treatment plants and 3 wastewater treatment plants. Those wastewater treatment plants are along the coast, and as such are vulnerable to storm surge and sea level rise. We have about a workforce of about 3,000 and annual revenues of about 800 million. Some of the stresses that we deal with, we talk about them in terms of sudden events like hurricanes, we call those shocks, or cybersecurity, versus things that affect our system over time. We're all familiar with aging infrastructure. Sea level rise is also something that we consider a stressor. It's similar though. It's a shock, however, when we have king tide flooding, which maybe Katie will speak about a little bit later. When we actually have flooding events from king tide, because our sea levels have already risen about 4 inches in the last, I think, 20 years, but she can cover that a little in more detail. And then just in context, I think it's really important to understand where your utility functions in context to its environment and its larger county services. So we say seagrass to sawgrass. So if you look to the east, that is Biscayne Bay, and that's the seagrass environment. And as you work west, you can see the light area, which is the urbanized area. And then just adjacent west to that is some agricultural uses, and then bleeds right into the Everglades, which is a 1.5 million acre wetland. It's a very shallow wetland river, if you will. They call it the River of Grass. All of our economic drivers are really weather dependent. We say that our environment is our economy, and our economy is our environment. So I think that gives you a good perspective of where we're coming from. This One Water diagram on the left talks to water supply, wastewater, and flooding. Again, we're at WASD, we are these 2 bubbles here. And there are issues, challenges with working across all stakeholders to get to this preferred state of integrated management, right? I heard some of them mentioned in that great diagram that Meghna just showed, accessibility to data. The other one I wanted to bring up is when your silo mission, when you're only looking at your one mission, stormwater or wastewater, the end result may not be the best for your natural environment. And that's what we're seeing in our area for sure. And then quite frankly, we could all do a better job of gaining community voices and the development of policies and programs. I mean, it's hard enough sometimes to break down the silos and coordinate across all the sectors, and we can't leave the community out either. So we really need to do a better job in that area. So we were selected as one of 5 cities across the globe to implement a city water resilience approach pilot. And part of that process, I know this is very busy, was to map out your system. So what you see here is really like the water the water system complete from clouds and vapor all the way down to disposal of your wastewater. So the green boxes are the natural features, like I mentioned to you already, Biscayne Bay, the aquifer, the Everglades. The dark blue are the artificial features in terms of how you're managing and providing services. So your canals for flood control, your treatment plants for drinking water, sewage and drainage, stormwater drainage systems. And the light blue is your consumers, the consumers of the water. And then cross-sector consideration, which I won't go into detail now, but you see energy there. So that those are the assets, right? And then when you throw the actors on top, and don't worry about reading these, but these are entities that either plan, regulate, provide services across individual assets in the system or whole processes. So it really helps you to understand who's engaged and who to engage when you're dealing with actually with shocks and stresses, because it helps you understand who's investing in what assets. So yeah, this shows you again the complete system defined. If I was just looking at water and sewer department, I wouldn't have half of these items on here. So this is that concept of trying to broaden and connect to other pieces of your larger system. And then it's even more busy when you take the municipality piece up here and you break it out. We have 32 cities just within the county. And several of those cities are wholesale water customers or sewer customers, meaning some of them have their own infrastructure that they're responsible for within the geography of their city. So again, those are decisions and governance that's happening at all these different scales. So in addition to defining the system, we also sort of graded ourselves. Over 200 stakeholders looked at, I think, over 60 indicators of resilience to understand what our strengths and weaknesses were. This is a whole process that's actually available, the model, to anybody who wants to undergo it. We had some main actions out of that. One is to establish an open data platform. You hear this already from earlier today and yesterday, to really improve the accessibility and sharing between stakeholders. And then establish a One Water knowledge portal. I think someone just mentioned that, like, how are we training and gaining knowledge? So our area recognized that as a need as well. And then the last piece is really that, I guess what you're calling defining the governance, right? We also said we need to build collaboration pathways, whether informal, some that already exist, build those up, but maybe some formal ones through MOUs and other methods, different entities. I think we're thinking the same thing than what I just heard. So I wanted to just provide a couple examples of how we're using data and analytics for water supply and management. So as I mentioned, we're at the end of the regional water system. The water flows this way into Everglades National Park. There's a lot of demand for the water. So there's water supply for your consumers, your domestic uses, industrial uses. The environment needs this water to be replenished and to replenish our aquifer for drinking water. And then there's agricultural uses. We have a big agricultural area, and it's difficult when you're trading flood control management that may impact the groundwater levels for agriculture. So that's a very delicate balance. But we're doing a lot of work. The department has grants and programs with the USGS to understand the hydrology and the geology of our area, to understand that ground and water surface interface and how it's influenced by sea level rise, how the saltwater intrusion is coming in from the coast. This research I mentioned because it's one of those data sets that's used and it is used by many, but can be used by even more stakeholders. We use it to actually change the way we withdraw water. We have probably the world's most comprehensive salt front monitor network in the world. So we have a few dozen wells, and we understand where that salt front line is, and we change where we're withdrawing from the different well fields in our area so that we don't exacerbate the issue of the salt front coming further inland. We're also looking, remember, we are the drinking water and wastewater, utility, but we're realizing there's wet and dry seasons. And sometimes during the wet season, we have an excess of water availability, but we don't need it. We're starting to look at how do we use storage and other smart technologies to benefit environmental restoration or flood control for areas that are prone to flood, which is going to be a bigger issue for us soon. The last thing I wanted to mention is a major effort underway that really emphasizes the need for a one water approach is to address the water quality in our Biscayne Bay. Unfortunately, we have high nutrient and bacteria levels that are causing significant issues. You may have seen some news coverage of large fish kills. So it really will be imperative for us we're already looking at sharing data, understanding, so we know what the sources of the pollution are and what are the investments to reduce the most, get the biggest bang for your buck, whether it's stormwater runoff, how many septic tanks do we need to convert versus all of them, so we can make really intelligent decisions to deal with this critical issue. So lastly, again, here's the one water concept. We're looking at data going into these activities, planning, investing. We develop healthy systems. It's quite simplistic, but you do result in a resilient community. And again, that community can support these types of water management. That's what I have for you today. Thank you so much.
Debbie, thank you. This was fantastic. And, it's clear what I take away from your presentation. With WASDE, it seems like all complexities related to one water are coming together. And, living in Manhattan, it always makes me think, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. I also like your statement, everything around water is economy, and economy is water, because at the end of the day, that's a big part of your responsibility. And I also think that's something our next speaker can relate to. We stay in Florida with Catherine Hageman. Catherine is the Resilience Program Manager for Adaptation within the Office of Resilience at Miami-Dade County. Catherine's work focuses primarily on climate change and adaptation to sea level rise. Before moving to Miami, she worked on coastal climate adaptation during the post-Sandy Rebuild by Design and National Disaster Resilience Competition. She earned her Master's of Environmental Science from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Science, where she studied how cities can use a hybrid of gray and green infrastructure to adapt to rising sea levels and reduce flood risks. Kathy, it's all yours.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I will start to share my screen, and let me know if you can see it. Need just a second to pull it up. But thank you, and Debbie also, thank you so much for setting the context. And my job at the Office of Resilience is really to focus on one of the stressors that was mentioned of sea level rise. So I'll talk more about that in how we're adapting in Miami-Dade County, and because I think it relates. And it's interesting to hear also, as Edgar mentions, we tend to think that we have the most complex system here, but I have heard a lot of similarities with others who've been speaking earlier today. So that was really interesting. So before I get going, I just want to double check, Edgar, that you're able to hear me okay, and also able to see the screen okay.
It's all good. Yep, thank you.
Great. Okay. So the Miami, of course, we often make the top 10 lists internationally as this area most at risk of sea level rise. So this map is showing what our sort of locked in sea level rise looks like with our historic carbon pollution on the right, and with a 1.5 degree world on the left. And as you can see, the impact for our area is extensive, and kind of regardless of which emissions pathway we take, we'll have to do quite a bit of adaptation to rising sea levels over the coming decades. And that's in large measure because of where the city, our urban area was built. So this is historic pictures from the beginning of the last century, dredging the canals to drain the Everglades. So the Everglades ecosystem that we have today extended well into the city. And so areas like our current airport, for example, were previously wetlands and part of that Everglades ecosystem. Similarly, along the coast, where we have incredibly dense and high value property, the landscape, that same exact spot looked like this just at the turn of the last century. So on land that's just naturally a few feet above sea level, we've built quite a dense urban area. And much of the land that we've built upon is constructed. So just a fun fact, I saw just today that a single lot on this man-made island sold for $30 million. So we have an incredible amount of value now on land that was built with dredge and fill techniques just a few feet above sea level. At the time of construction, sea level rise wasn't part of the calculus. And so our starting point now is just a few feet, in some cases inches, above high tide. This is a picture from high tide earlier this year. It gives you a good example of kind of our starting point from a sea level rise perspective. As Devi mentioned, we've already had about 10 inches of sea level rise over the last century here. And so these kinds of scenes we see on sunny days in the fall when we typically have higher tides and higher water levels. But we are only sort of beginning to see the changes that we expect, and we're planning for about 2 feet of sea level rise in the next 40 years. But of course, sea level rise will continue beyond that horizon and could be, as much as 6 feet by the end of the century, hopefully much less. But nevertheless, in our region, it will have quite a big impact. So our natural landscape, though, you can see this pattern that was formed in part underwater, the landscape that we're built on now in a geologic sense. So the brown and red areas are high ground of this limestone ridge, and then the low ground on either side on the East Coast and also on the western areas. And we really have two coasts in the sense that we have the Everglades to our west and that ecosystem that we're working very hard to restore and raise the water levels in the Everglades to restore the hydrology that was, as much as we can before it was drained. But of course, raising the water levels in the Everglades also presents challenges given the proximity of development to those areas. So if we think of a cross section, we essentially have a ridge of high ground and then two areas of low ground, but we sit on top of a shallow aquifer that's the source of drinking water that WASDE mentioned and manages. And our water system is heavily managed by a state agency. The South Florida Water Management District is responsible for managing the system constructed by the Army Corps and shifting fresh water around as best they can during the wet season and dry season to balance a number of competing goals, one of which Debbie already alluded to, but historically saltwater intrusion was quite a problem after they began the project of draining the Everglades. And so they constructed a system of salinity control features to balance that out. But now we have a relatively complex system that requires managing these different needs, and in some cases weighing trade-offs between flood risk and saltwater intrusion and sea level rise. I'll skip these. But sea level rise kind of complicates this because one solution would be to raise the water levels in the interior and help balance out the sea level rise that we see along the coast, kind of balancing a seesaw. But of course, it can't really raise water levels in the west too much when we have this kind of, when we have development very close to our western areas. Especially as we've seen this a couple of weeks ago with tropical storms bringing very heavy amounts of water. It's a very delicate balance to strike. So the sea level rise strategy that Arcadis helped us develop, looks at our landscape and breaks it down by typology. And as Debbie alluded to, this kind of cross-section, and looks at the hazards of sea level rise and how we can address our water challenges based on these different typologies to deal with this vulnerability. Some of our toughest areas are these low-lying areas along our canals and rivers that we see across the whole county, cutting east to west. But we have to manage sea level rise not as a standalone issue, but as it exacerbates all of these other, as it sort of ripples through our whole water system. So changing our stormwater system, as Debbie talked about in detail, changing our water, freshwater and stormwater systems as well. So it really affects all of it. And unfortunately, we don't have the luxury that is available to places like Amsterdam to sort of insulate ourselves from the rising sea levels. Because of our porous geology, it's very difficult to construct walls or levee systems that would keep that water out. So you have sort of a porous and permeable aquifer and geology underneath us that means we really have to learn to live with the water. So the sea level rise strategy outlines 5 approaches, sort of a menu of options that we can take in different geographical areas to adapt and to hopefully deal with these challenges in a way that also complements the other goals that we're trying to achieve, water quality and managing other flood risks as well. We don't have time really to go into detail, but each one of these approaches that we talk about is really intended to help our decision makers and our community kind of understand what these trade-offs are with pictures and with images and a clear discussion of the trade-offs that come with each of these approaches so that we can have more informed decision makers and community members to weigh in on how they would like to see their community adapted, whether by expanding greenways, making more space for water, like we have in many places, or making more space for green infrastructure and distributed water throughout the community. But I will with a send-off, I'll say that, you know, one of the big challenges that we have, and part of the reason why we have such a qualitative approach to the sea level rise strategy is that we have many actors within our area, as others do as well, but we don't have yet a sort of uniform modeling infrastructure that would allow us to quantitatively evaluate multiple adaptation approaches in a seamless way. We have, you know, different approaches for modeling our surface and groundwater, different approaches for modeling our storm surge, and we find that working with different agencies or funders, sort of internal funders like the Army Corps or FEMA, have rules that dictate what types of models, what types of inputs, what types of outputs are valuable to them. And it requires, in my observation, starting afresh a lot of times with each project to kind of justify it using the models or methods that are needed by whoever the particular funder is. And that in some cases leads us to solutions that aren't necessarily as cohesive with some of the other things that we're looking at. So for example, we work very closely with the Army Corps of Engineers on a number of studies. Our beach, Everglades Restoration, they constructed the floodwater, the flood management system that we have in South Florida, and then working with a different office to think about our storm surge attenuation. And and one of the proposals that they're put forward is to create a surge wall and gate system, which would help stop the storm surge from propagating inland, which in a perfect world would be what we're looking for. But it has to fit, as I mentioned, with this very complex system that we have already. And it's very difficult on the timelines available to us to model that and really quantitatively evaluate, weighing these different freshwater flooding risks versus saltwater storm surge risks, and in addition to the kind of chronic stretches like tidal flooding and stormwater flooding. So it's a challenge, and I am grateful that so many people are helping to think through it, because it certainly would help us in a very real and practical way in Miami-Dade. But I would also say that, you know, we have come a long way also in modeling and understanding the value that our natural areas play, but I also think that those tend to fall in their own silo as well, sort of quantitating the value of those natural ecosystems. And it's not yet integrated as much as we would like to see in the kind of comprehensive modeling that's needed for down here, because we have quite a wealth of natural resources in Miami, but it's hard to integrate those into many of the evaluations that I've been a part of. So with that, I'll stop and say thank you and pass it back to Edgar.
Thank you, Katie. Well, this was a fantastic presentation, some very good images. I think clearly speaking to the tremendous responsibility that the county is taking on, and also your Office of Resilience, the way you're setting, defining the agenda, clarifying risk to the many people involved, not just communities, but the stakeholders you work with at a daily basis, including the Army Corps, who came with that interesting proposal with that wall along, I think it was Brickell, the Brickell waterfront. So we may hear more about that in the discussion. We are moving to the next speaker, Chet Pinder. Chet was part of the previous panel as well. So we're shifting gear from a big organization, WASDE, 3,000 people, to a slightly smaller organization, I believe around 60. But responsibilities don't always speak to the number of people, I think, that you have within your organization. And Chet will probably speak more to that. So Chet Pinder, he joined the Delaware River Basin Commission in 2005. Chet has supervised both the permitting and planning sections of the commission, and he currently serves as the manager of water resources planning, where he supervises a staff of planners whose responsibilities include the long-term water supply planning of the Delaware River Basin, as well as the enforcement of the rules and regulations of the commission. Prior to joining the commission, Chet held positions within the Philadelphia Water Department in both the source water protection and stormwater program. Chet, please take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Edgar. Everybody, can you see my screen, Edgar?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some data drivers and tools that the commission is currently utilizing. I showed this slide earlier, I won't harp on it, but again, just to focus in on water quantity and water quality is really kind of the guts of what the commission does on a daily basis. And we're organized in these 4 silos: planning, operations, our permitting group, also called project review, and our science and water quality group. I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of those and some of the data drivers in each. And I'll start with our planning group. And this is the group that I supervise or I manage. And some of the things that we're looking at is sustainable water out to the year 2060. And some of the items that are critical components to doing an analysis like that, is understanding or predicting future water use. How do we project future water? What portion of that water use is consumptive? What role does increasing water efficiency play in future water use? And water auditing, and that's a requirement for our public water suppliers. And I'll speak a little bit about some of the improvement in data and something that my group is utilizing today. And I'll start with water withdrawals. Sounds relatively simple, but there's been a tremendous amount of progress, I think, in the last probably 10 years or so in terms of this data and the quality of this data. One is, and you might find it hard to believe that, people still report water use on a system level, or they have, and we're finally transitioning to the actual point of withdrawal. And what does that mean? Instead of a well field, we're actually getting data for each individual well. More accurate data. Is it metered? How precise is that meter? How often is it calibrated? Or is it an estimate based on hours of a pump? So these are all improvements, and really depends on the sector that you're looking at. Agricultural data versus public water supply data, very different quality data. But there are improvements being made. Another is better data structure, and I think that's something that some folks have talked about today, and some of the challenges with that. But really the improvement in databases, the ability to share data through databases. One of the programs that I believe the USGS spoke a little bit about earlier today was the water program, which is providing funding to our states in order to enable better data sharing. And we're a direct beneficiary of those programs. We're kind of a secondary benefit, other than the state programs. We're an actual user of that data. So we certainly appreciate the investment that the federal government is making with that program. Online reporting, the web, right? Data getting from the actual withdrawer, from your utilities into state programs and then onto other users. That facilitates a much faster data exchange and the ability to actually use that data for planning or for other purposes. And then, site-specific consumptive use. Instead of having to rely on, industry defaults or sector-specific defaults, understanding your withdrawers and being able to assign a site-specific consumptive use factor rather than rely on a generic. And then a little bit about our data analytics software improvements. In my time at the commission, I've seen this transformation from Excel to Access, and most of our new staff are really using RStudio. They've gone outside the Excel environment to handle increasingly large data sets, faster, quicker, more robust. So just that, you'll see that, I think, across all of our work programs is the improvement in software. A little bit about water use data. And what I'm really missing on this slide is the actual utilities or the actual withdrawer from the environment who measures their withdrawal of water from the environment, and then usually as a permit requirement reports that to the regulatory agency. And in this case, in our states, in our basin, it's the 4 basin states: New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. And that data is usually in an Excel type of format. And the commission is able to either retrieve that data through portal exchanges or through database downloads, et cetera. But then we take that data and we put it into an R environment for analysis. One of the things, and this, again, some folks might think this is relatively simple, but there is a lot of metadata about the data. Our geospatial data is certainly getting better than it was. Believe it or not, there are withdrawals that had 0 locational data. It might have a zip code or a municipality. And so that data, is finally, I think, getting to the point where it's geospatially correct for probably about 99% of the sources in our basin. In the public water supply arena, we are lucky in the Delaware River Basin in that most of our public water supply utilities are required to do a water audit. It's not that way throughout the country, so that's a unique data set, a holistic data set for our basin that probably does not exist nationwide. And another item that we talk about with the movement of water is the interconnection data between utilities, not necessarily just focused on what's being withdrawn for the environment, but what is being moved and utilized by purveyors between each other. And then categorizing our water use with different sectors. You'll see there's kind of 6 that the commission uses, but those are, they can be further categorized down to much finer detail. One of the outcomes of some of this data is we're projecting water use, and you'll see here, what I'm plotting here is annual data from a utility from the late 80s to I think 2018. And being able to actually have 20 plus years, 30 years of data for withdrawals is that's pretty good. We don't have that everywhere, or at least some of the data wasn't digitized or it's not readily available. But we've made great progress in being able to create databases with this data and being able to project out and understand the water withdrawal history of any of our utilities or any of our withdrawers, not limited to our public water supply arena. and this enables us to have more confidence in projecting out future water use in our basin. And I think what for us, when we plan for 2060, what I feel confident in today is that we're creating kind of a framework that can be easily updated in the future. And us knowing that this isn't going to be used 40 years from now, but we're creating the foundation for it. In our permitting group, and this is kind of on the wastewater side, on the water quality modeling, better in-stream data, whether it's remote sensing, increased analytical tools, laboratory tools, you name it. We're getting better in-stream data and effluent data. And that equates, at least in our organization, to better water quality models, better permitting decision, better waste load allocations, higher confidence. And the more confident you are in the outcome, the better it is for the regulated entities who are then required to implement, whether it's new effluent limits or a different type of treatment in their wastewater treatment system, that those capital outlays are done with a higher level of confidence. In the water withdrawal arena for surface water flows, this concept of getting real-time data and regulating it almost on a real-time basis, that's in the future. We've got requirements for pass-by flow requirements for withdrawals. So we've got folks who use gauges and moving to real-time management of resources. And for us, one of the things that we see on the horizon is then being able to issue automatically generated alerts to our regulated community that, hey, stream gauge X is showing a flow of this. You're close to some operational trigger, something along those lines. Another important component of all this data is data sharing. We've talked a bit about it today and I believe yesterday. For us, we share a lot of our data with the public. A lot of this is public facing. This is a graphic that's done in the Shiny Apps realm for a management area in southeastern Pennsylvania. It's basically the suburban area around the city of Philadelphia where there's a groundwater management program. And a user can access this. That link is live. And you can see pretty quickly up to the year 2018, historical groundwater withdrawals for certain subbasins, and those withdrawals compared to what regulatory limits are in place. And so we've been able to create a framework where we can update this regularly. It's not quite real time, but it's better than it was in the years past, and I expect the improvements to continue. In our operations group, where we handle reservoir and flow management, we're doing modeling, salinity modeling, and what you see here is a graphic of, in the red is a salt line. This is in the tidal Delaware River. So again, subject to salinity intrusions moving up from the Atlantic Ocean into Delaware Bay up into the upper parts of the river, and a management program in place to prevent that salt front from impacting the city of Philadelphia's drinking water intakes. And so we're trying to understand the effects of sea level rise and how that would impact the movement of this salt line. And then, what then are our management options to help protect against that. Another component of our data sharing, our online dashboards, trying to put multiple data sets into one place. So what we have here are some USGS gauges that are flow triggers or management places for the commission and others, along with some Army Corps and New York City data all in one place, so the public can see the things that are at play with terms of managing our water resources in the Delaware. And this is in ArcGIS. In our science and water quality group, water quality sampling, again, remote samplers, real-time sampling. I envision that will only continue to increase. And then how do we analyze that data? How do we operationalize that data? Improvements in software, And again, this larger data sets, how do you analyze it? How do you make it public friendly, et cetera. A couple in our water quality group are 2 examples of data sharing to the public. Again, these are all public facing. This is in our, again, a Shiny Apps product where the commission has what we call as a boat run data set. It's one of the longest data sets of water quality from the 60s for the main stem Delaware. So it's a really important data set. And for us to be able to create tools for the public to visualize and have it available for public consumption is helpful for others. You could choose a parameter and a year, and you can start to see different graphics there. Another component is our special protection waters, and this is essentially our non-tidal Delaware River. So from Trenton, which is the head of tide, north to basically the upper parts of the basin. It's an anti-degradation reach. And this is where there's a robust set of data. And we've primarily the commission has been the one gathering that data, sampling that data, but being able to make it available to the public in a user-friendly format. So this is another example of that data sharing. And that is the end of my slide. So just wanted to give everyone a taste of some of our data drivers, how we use it, and really how we're trying to share it to the public in different, more user-friendly ways, rather than just sitting in a database and waiting for someone to ask for it. And that is all I've got. So thank you, Edgar, and others.
Thank you. Well, that was very informative and pretty amazing. All the work and knowledge that sits in the data analytics and how it's taking shape within your organization. Moving on to the last speaker, and a special welcome. I would say it's almost 11 o'clock in the evening in the Netherlands. So we have Kees van der Lucht with us. I guess Kees, that comes with being the director of the World WaterNet. It's 24/7. You're always present, I guess, but nevertheless, Kees, you focus on international activities based on knowledge and experience of WaterNet, the public water cycle company of the Amsterdam region, and you are responsible for projects in Asia, South America, and you also connect the WaterNet R&D program with the international knowledge partners that you work with. And as a program director, you're also responsible for the conference program of the Amsterdam International Water Week. Kees, there's a lot I know that you have to share, so please go ahead, take it away. And I'll share my screen with your presentation.
Yeah, please. Yeah, thanks, Edgar. Good afternoon, good evening, and happy to share some experiences of WaterNet. As you can see, also an Amsterdam smart city. The next one, please. Just a short introduction on the regional water management in the Netherlands. It's basically about 3 organizations, and that's the drinking water companies, of course, for the drinking water supply, the municipalities for the sewerage, and the regional water authorities. And that's for the other tasks. So that's about wastewater treatment, safety, surface water quality. And what you see is that there is a huge scaling up. For example, in the last 70 years, the number of regional water authorities changed from 2,600 till 23. So that's huge. But as there is a huge scaling up, the task still stayed the same the last more or less hundreds of years. Next slide, please. Well, you could say until 2016, then WaterNet was started, and that was the first, water cycle company in the Netherlands. And that was due to, there was a merging required within the departments of Amsterdam and the regional water authority. And then they decided to have one foundation that would do all their tasks. So, and that was the starting point for WaterNet. And that means that we are doing, well, drinking water, wastewater, sewerage, safety, going open and closing the bridges in the canals. We are doing that with 2,000 employees and are serving 1.2 million of people in Amsterdam and surrounding. The next one, please. Yeah, as you all probably know, we are living below sea level, and the purple part you see, that's where the economy grows. The most important part of the Netherlands is the deepest part of the Netherlands. In Amsterdam, we have places of 5 meters below sea level and places of 1 meter above sea level. The climate change has a lot of impact. And that's in the first place, the flash floods. We had our wake up call in 2015 with 100 millimeter rainfall. We had our wake up call for the droughts, well, 2 years ago, just 2 years ago. And last year again. And so we had on a national level a delta plan for flooding, and we are now starting a delta plan for droughts. For Amsterdam, we started an Amsterdam Rainproof after our wake-up call in 2016. That is a platform, and now we are finding out strategies for also dealing with the droughts. And the last one is, of course, the sea level rising, where we have to cope with. The River Rhine is important for us because it's the source for drinking water, but also a potential cause for flooding. So the change of the discharge of the River Rhine caused by the climate change is also a very, very important thing for us. Next one, please. Yeah, then the history of the water cycle in less than 1 minute. In 60-65, we started with flushing our canals because the water quality was too bad. In 1850, we started to collect our household refuse. And at the same time, we started with producing drinking water from the dunes. 30 years later, in 1880, we had our first sewerage, and that was after a cholera epidemic. In 1923, 50 years later, we had our first wastewater treatment. In 1982, we had no more discharge mere of untreated wastewater. So, well, it took us a long time. 2006, we had WaterNet, and 2012, we had our first city swim. And you can see that as the result, there's a lot of policy and implementation, and having back a swimmable and river and livable canal. Next one, please. The government for WaterNet, we are the lowest organization. We have in the Netherlands 12 provinces. We have to deal with 3 of them. They have an responsibility for some tasks of us. And it's the same with the national government. That's for the drinking water, for example. And finally, the European Union. The European Union has, more or less 70% of the regulation for us. So they have a huge impact on our strategy, policy, and daily operations. Next one, please. Yeah, data and censoring is that's the issue of our research and development program. One of the 5 themes we are dealing with, but it's also had in mind of WaterNet. We want to be a fully data-driven organization in 2024, and that means a lot. That means data-driven decision making. but also data-driven business operations. So we are working on all these fields about sharing data, about remote control for our assets. It's about optimizing our systems with real-time data. And it's also about real-time social media communication with our customers. To work on this, we needed to separate things and choose an approach for working for IT on assets, customers, and employees. And to give you an example of the importance, well, this week we decided to have a chief information officer. That's for the cybersecurity, but also for all those IT developments that are needed. Next one, please. Yeah, and then current challenges we have. Well, that's in the first place a kind of resistance to change. For example, we've made a dashboard for an important part of our water system, and that included 4 neighboring authorities who are dealing with the same system. And for example, experts, it was very difficult for them to share their knowledge, to bytes, to files, and more or less give it away. Because what are you for an expert if your knowledge is all gone? So those things we had to deal with. It took us 5 years to build up trust and to choose the right shared technical system and have an operating dashboard. Citizen engagement. Citizens are more and more critical. They are well informed. They want to cooperate, but want to do a lot by themselves. We've chosen to do a lot on social media, but also involve them in our projects. But it's not always easy. For example, with decentral systems for sanitation, we really need that they deal in the right way with black and gray systems. If they don't do that right, the end responsibility is at our side. So it's difficult to make good appointments about that. Then public-private cooperation. That's for example dealing with tech providers, and dashboard is a good example, but also predicting our floodings and droughts. How far do we want to go by more or less giving it away to private companies? The other side is that you have to have your systems also from providers. You can't develop it alone, while a lot of people want to do that. Limiting regulations is last example. Well, we have privacy regulations from the EU, and they are, for example, limiting our possibilities, the way we can communicate with our customers. Next one, please. Yeah, and well, we can't do it alone, and we need to stay updated, certainly in those technical, with this technical developments. And two ways we are doing that is with knowledge partners. So that are the utilities from Berlin, Copenhagen, New York, DEP, Paris, Singapore. And what we are doing is we are finding out at each other's operations what are the main themes to present, to share, and to pick up at the other side. And that's working in bilateral and multilateral way. And it's every time it's really interesting that we are working on the same subjects, although the situations differs a lot. And I have to say that I think well, sharing on data and technical developments are maybe the most difficult things to share, while it's maybe also the most important issue. And then the benchmarking, we are doing that at the level of the Netherlands and Europe, well, to learn from each other. The example I presented here is a presentation of the budgets that the citizen has to pay for major cities in the Netherlands. And then the final slide, please. Yeah, here you see the city swim. We started in 2012, like I mentioned. That was after the last connection of the houseboat to the sewerage system. The canal was clean enough. And well, I also want to show this picture because a swimmable canal is a good example of a tangible goal. And that's for implementing goals, targets are very important because people understand that you want to get your canal clean and they are willing to pay for that, and they want to do that more easier than to do it for achieving a goal from the EU. And we are also working on this swimmable river with Paris. They want to have a swimmable Seine in 2024 when the Olympic Games are there. We are doing that with Berlin, and we are even included in a mayor's for a drinkable Meuse river, which is a last example of going still further with putting your goal on the horizon. So, well, this is it. Thank you for your attention. Back to Edgar.
Thank you, Kees. This is fantastic, and I guess there's two signs that show that your water is clean. I would say the first one in Amsterdam, is that you can ice skate in the summer, and obviously the second one, if your queen is swimming in your canals, that's I guess the best showcase of clean water, and that definitely speaks to I think the way Waternet is also working public perception, understanding of the tremendous asset that you have, which is water, which relates to what we talked about in Miami. I'm looking at the time. Sunil, how much time do we have for Q&A?
Edgar, let me look at the schedule. I think we have time for open discussion.
Okay, good.
Because yeah, we have until 5:15 to wrap up.
Well, maybe I can start with a question, but please post them in the chat, and maybe Kees, to follow up on what you've just presented, and also through my own understanding. I work with Waternet for about a decade, mostly very pleasantly, but it was also for me a showcase of how challenging, managing water from an organizational perspective, how challenging that can. Water management is highly regulated and a refined practice in the Netherlands, which I would say works very well in a day-to-day basis. But the climate challenges we're all facing is also something that the city of Amsterdam has ahead of them. We heard Katie speak about potentially 6 feet of sea level rise to the end of the century. So how does that that refined practice come into play when we talk about the longer term strategies that that Waternet is dealing with?
I think it's on two levels. It's in the first place having a long-term strategy for heavy rainfalls as well as droughts. And for example, with the wake-up call for the flash floods, well, more or less we started with setting a goal for the number of storage we needed to, well, have a robust system. And putting this, having this goal set, then we can manage what's necessary. And that's, for example, starting a platform. But on the other hand, it's also about, meanwhile, how do you operate your daily business? So, for example, with licensing, you have a point at your horizon, but what are you doing with your licensing for people who want to have another water level? And that's also update your regulation system often enough. And if you are doing that, take into account all these trends you have to deal with.
Yeah, maybe as a follow-up, I see a question from the audience from Sabrina Helmeyer. Could Kees elaborate a bit more on the relatively new challenge in the Netherlands, which relates to drought? Past 3 years, extensive periods of drought. What does it mean for drinking water production?
It means a lot for the drinking water production, and that's for Waternet. We for more than 50% we are depending on water from the River Rhine. We infiltrate the River Rhine in our dune system, and then extract it again and treat it and distribute it. But with 2 years now of drought, we have to look into alternatives, because we have some storage in drought periods, but if it goes on like this, it will not be enough. So now we are working on a third source. We have also groundwater in other part of our area, but we are working now on the possibilities to get groundwater from a deeper polder that's salt water, and we want to desalinate it with a membrane that's below the surface, below in the underground. And we are doing that now on pilot level, but the need for a third source of drinking water, if you had asked me that 5 years ago, we have been thinking about it. It was not necessary, but that now really changed in 2 years' time.
Yeah, and maybe related to this, is this also the space where you collaborate with the Global Water Research Institute? A question from Ken, or other water organizations, or do you generate this insights yourself?
Well, we have relatively a large research and development department, but no, our strategy is to work together with a lot of partners, and that's also what we are doing, and that's national and international. I already mentioned the cooperation with all the utilities worldwide, but it's also about knowledge institutes, universities, and peer utilities.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Maybe a follow-up for you, Katie. You know, we've seen some new technologies presented by Chet, and I saw some drone technologies from Waternet. How do you think, you know, technologies can help bridge the gap in adaptation planning, you know, needed for Miami-Dade County?
I think that we've one of the most important things that we really need in terms of adaptation planning is integrating the models that exist and making sure that they can speak to each other. Also, I really enjoyed the presentation earlier that was talking about moving away or alternatives to linear modeling, where we spend a lot of work on assumptions up front, a lot of money on running just a handful of runs, and then we get a result at the end that we can't change. And we often find that the result of those 10 runs isn't helpful, actually, which is frustrating after spending years of work and so much careful thought on all the assumptions. And I've been part of many projects like that. I think it's just kind of a challenge of that linear modeling system. So I think having tools that allow us to try different alternatives and test different assumptions in a quicker way would be incredibly helpful, but also one in which I think goes back to the governance issue of thinking of our data and information and models as infrastructure, in the sense that they're that the agencies can share and build upon them from project to project. Often many projects start afresh with a model that's been developed, but with fresh assumptions or a fresh approach, and that can be a little disheartening. It often takes us back to the drawing board. So any sort of technologies that help us build upon previous projects and try and use those as stepping stones and preserve the work that's gone on in a previous project, that would be a huge help. And I'm sure that that's doable. I just have to defer to others on how that gets done.
Well, yeah, maybe let's defer that to Chad. I mean, you had a highly technical presentation. You spoke about these technologies. What would you see as potential water resource technology barriers in this regard to your organization?
I think one of the barriers may not actually be the use of the technology, but communicating the results of your project. And I think, at least from my perspective, that's to all stakeholders. So that could be the public, taking pretty complex results, of a project. In our line of work, you need to articulate that to the public. You may need to articulate that to the regulated entities, whether they're utilities, and then also decision makers, and they could be elected officials, et cetera. And so, as engineers, scientists, water resource professionals, I think we need to be cognizant that we live in a complex environment, or we work in a complex environment with technical items, and we need to be able to communicate these projects, the goals, the outcomes, the reasons, and we need to be able to do that at a level for others who may not be comfortable with our jargon to understand and to be able to make sound decisions based on what we provide to them. So that's a barrier that, as myself as an engineer, I know I need to strive to do better when I'm explaining something to a decision maker. And I think that's probably for all of us.
Yeah, I guess part of that challenge also relates to climate uncertainty. So how will data change and become more clear over time? But that's not a reality we are currently facing. So you have to make decisions based upon a certain level of uncertainty. Is that? Can you elaborate a bit on that? And I would also have that same question for you, Kees. Maybe we start with Chad.
Yes, communicating uncertainty, right? That's a tough one. For what we do, it's there's risk, and again, it's articulating what we do know, what we don't know, and some level of confidence in the data or in the outcome. That it might be just as important to explain to people what we don't know, just as much as what we do know. And that might give a little bit of credence to decision makers. But yeah, that I don't have the answers to that one, other than
you're making some points, I think. I mean, but bridging just to Amsterdam, you know, the climate uncertainty at the same time. Kees, you mentioned that about 70% of policies is being directed through the European Union. So if that trickles down, or the way that trickles down also through the involvement of the Dutch government, and then, you know, you get to Waternet as an organization, and you overlay that governmental play with uncertainty. How do you think and plan beyond that?
Yeah, well, that's challenging. On one hand, you have you could say that maybe the technical part of it, and we are used to dealing with uncertainties for our levies, because that's just well, in the area where a big part of Amsterdam, there is a chance of 1 in 10,000 years that a dike will break down. We are used to do investments based on these calculations, but with all the other climate change, it's getting more difficult dealing with flash floods, dealing with droughts, and the EU gives us now. We have to make risk management plans, and in which we have to say which areas are most under risk and which not. So that's a practical way of dealing with it, but it is hard because you need a lot of information and data of your area. The other side of it is that it also about well, awareness. And we had, I think 3-4 years ago in the Netherlands, an important survey by the OECD, and they about the water management in the Netherlands. And one of their main conclusions was that the people in the Netherlands were not aware anymore what the risks and uncertainties were in our country for water. So nobody knew that they were living below sea level. And then it's hard to do your investments, then it's hard to have the support of the citizens. So based on that, we started also in Amsterdam with awareness. Also Amsterdam Rainproof after flash floods was in the first place about awareness.
Yeah, so you mentioned risk management plans, and maybe Magna, I'm not sure if that's one of the operational activities that we acknowledged in our circle, but if we bring that, Debbie, to your practice, you know, as a partner utility in Miami, is that a way that you navigate your challenges as well within the different silos or disciplines that you have within your organization?
Risk management plan specifically?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, we just completed a risk assessment of our entire drinking water system. That really does help because you prioritize, you know, the criticality of your assets, then you compare to all the potential threats, and then you understand, you know, what to plan for each asset, and you come up with a prioritized list of improvements. But what I was thinking about in terms of the uncertainty is, you know, in our region, our 4-county region, we have a county compact. I don't know if Katie was going to mention this, but we have adopted, each county, each governing body has adopted these unified projections for sea level rise based on international IPCC data, based on NOAA data, but also based on our regional scientists and local considerations. But it's data that we that everyone has adopted, that we will, you know, it helps to kind of level that field, and that whole thing about inconsistency or uncertainty, and also what Katie said about people, you know, using different methodologies. So having that kind of agreement or those kind of unified tools really helps, like a utility, when I have to decide, you know, how do we design this asset to withstand or how do we spend the money for these adaptation components? And that gives kind of some backup to using and making those decisions. It helps. And it also helps bridge the gap of changes in leadership sometimes, which is a challenge I forgot to mention before.
Yeah. So if you were to look 5 years ahead, Debbie, and maybe it's a question for both Debbie and Katie, if you were to look 5 years ahead within Miami-Dade County, where do you think you will stand from an organizational perspective, and what may be the difference compared to right now? And it's in a way, what are the current barriers? That's constantly the what we try to bring in, and also what you will read back in the paper to come. In 5 years from now, what would be the ideal?
I don't know, Katie, do you want to speak to the sea level rise strategy or awareness? I think we're going to gain a lot more awareness in different sectors. Hopefully, the integration of considering sea level rise data, that whole data platform is critical. I think we're going to make advances in that and water quality for sure in our areas. We have a lot of work to do just in our utility, honestly, with data. A lot of what Chad mentioned, we're struggling with as well. Also, understanding water demands, is a tricky issue too. So.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I would just add, I think, the compact that Debbie alluded to has helped us coordinate regionally quite a bit, but I think we need to do even more of it. And I don't know if that means that there needs to be a formal governance change so much as more collaboration, a continued collaboration across from the state level to the county, the municipalities, the utilities. It's just it takes a lot of work, as I'm sure all of you know. That constant need to collaborate, and with projects having such different lifespans, a project may have been planned 5 years ago that's only coming to our attention now, and so it's a long process of integrating climate change into the planning and design of these systems and of projects. And I think the Water and Sewer Department has done a fantastic job for their own work, but it's something that we have to keep working on for the county projects, but also for the projects we coordinate with the federal government or with the state government. I think there's still a long way to go in terms of integrating climate change into actual project design.
thank you for your thoughts on that. And maybe a last question before we probably wrap it up. The last question for Kees, having gone through your organizational transition, Waternet exists for about 15 years, even though the whole water management play has been going on for hundreds of years. What would be your key recommendations for a smart One Water organization to be?
Yeah, well, I think it's about a good to set a goal that's interesting for everyone, and it's I think about knowledge sharing for all the utilities who are in, and share not only your good practices but also your challenges, because it starts with challenges, and be open on that, so you can create a roadmap that's interesting and safe for everyone, and maybe as last one, inspire.
Very good. Well, with that, Sunil, I think we are ready to wrap it up. I don't have further questions.
Sure. No, I mean, Meghna, do you want to wrap up anything you want for white paper? I mean, both Edgar and Meghna. Not just from panelists, from entire audience also. You want something?
Yeah, I think I've taken lots of notes today in terms of identifying additional partners. I think a lot of you folks who have not partnered with us in the white paper so far, I think have some great ideas. And so we'll be definitely, Edgar and I will be reaching out to some more colleagues in this call moving forward. But I think there's definitely a lot of good work happening across different groups and organizations. I think there is an opportunity for the ERC to leverage as we think about a governance and implementation strategy moving forward. Maybe something, I think that some thought needs to be put into it in terms of, instead of recreating a brand new organization, maybe leveraging what's already so many other folks already doing, and then come up with some innovative way to create an effort that could support the launching of the Smart One Water. So yeah, I think we're good right now. We're definitely reaching out. But Edgar, do you have anything else to add? Feedback and.
I think we've covered.
Yeah, we've got a lot of data to go through. A lot of information.
We have some rewinding to do, but no,
Yeah.
this was a fantastic discussion. I would like to thank all the presenters, the panel speakers, in case it's about midnight in the Netherlands.
Right. Yeah, I'd like to, especially all panel. It was great. I mean, I also learned a lot. And a special thank to Keith. I mean, I can do it. 12 midnight. Wow. So Keith, I really appreciate that you are awake until midnight to attend this.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
More than welcome. And it's without a jet lag. That's the advantage of doing it this way.
Right. So that's very positive, right? If you have to travel and come to Arlington, Virginia for this conference. Yeah. So that's okay. So let's give a big clap to all our these panelists. I really appreciate it. Okay, so now we need to wrap things up because it's a long day, I know, for everyone. Is Peter here? Kathy, do you see Peter Kraft?
Was going to be calling in. I do not see him currently.
Okay, that's fine. We don't have to do, in the virtual thing, but that's, so I would like to thank then if there is anything else we want to cover today, because tomorrow we also have a full day agenda. If you have time, I'm not requesting you, all of you, to attend full day. But again, tomorrow we will hear more from the utility. And also we will discuss two more things in the panel: workforce, which is coming a lot, and innovation ecosystem. So that's tomorrow is also, we have a very tight agenda starting early in the morning, not early in the morning, 11 a.m. Anything else from anyone? I know it's a very, very long day for